Larry, it's wonderful to talk to you today. I'm so appreciative that you were able to take time out from what you do in your life to spend some time and help us in these incredibly unusual times that we find ourselves in. And so I want to start by talking to you a little bit about the area, as I understand, of what your most recent expertise has been, and that is working with people who are grieving the loss of a loved one. And of course, in our time, we have people who are experiencing the loss of loved ones because of this virus, the COVID-19. But there's more in my congregation, people who are experiencing the loss of loved ones, but we couldn't be with them in their ends, or we couldn't have a funeral service or a memorial service like we usually do. And so everything is different. How are you experiencing that? And am I having good perception on this, or what more can you help us understand about the process of grief and walking with people through their end times in these times?
Yeah, and thanks for having me and doing a variation of conversation rather than me talking, at a camera by myself, which you probably spend way too much time doing now. But having a conversation is certainly a delightful thing. I have preached at your church a couple of times, and have always had very fond thoughts about memorial. So my background right now, and for the last at least getting paid for the last 8 years, although I was also volunteering prior to that. So I've been with Heinz Hospice for 10 years doing various things that relate to grief support. But the last 8 or so years, my official title, which I always kind of chuckle at, is bereavement support specialist. And that it's the specialist part that I think is always worth both, the frown and the smile, because nobody's a specialist. I mean, I have, in fact, behind me right now, there's one shelf devoted, to books on grief support. There's a lot of so-called experts out there, and I really trust many of them. But when we get to grief, even those of us who may think we know more, who are some element of a specialist, it's really no different. I mean, one of the things that we hear all the time, and I'm guessing you have experienced this in your life, as a pastor, when things get personal, suddenly whatever education, whatever experience we have really falls apart at times, and grief really does reveal some of the most vulnerable parts of who we are. And with the COVID-19, what is happening is it's everything you can think about, and I'll mention a few examples that relate to grief, are things which touch us deeply. When we are grieving, we don't think people understand what we're going through, and truly often people do not understand what you're going through. You feel at times very lonely. You feel at times as if the world around you is in a kind of either chaos, and you're adding to that chaos, or you feel like everything else is normal except for me. And I could keep going on with a list of all kinds of things that are just part of kind of that normal sense of what people are experiencing. Every part of this shelter in place, social distancing, reinforces and emphasizes some of those things that are already going to be happening with folks. Feel lonely during your grief? Well, then what is it like then to have to really stay inside, to not have contact with folks? And there is no doubt that when we are normally grieving, or we're in the time period, if a loved one is dying, or if a loved one is seriously ill and we're unsure of what is going to happen, there is a fairly normal part of us that will rationalize, I don't have time to go over today to visit them, or it scares me a little bit. We may not say it scares me a little bit, but there's a part of us that, if we're going to be honest, that we'll come up with those excuses to not do things, at the same time knowing that when you are with another person, whether it's when they're grieving or whether it's, in a serious illness or dying, it's beneficial for both of you. That's, for a lot of people, been eliminated. One of the things I do at the hospice work is call folks after the loved one has died. And gosh, the first calls I was making, it was probably even before the shelter in place, because there was already things, starting to happen in early March in terms of warnings and what have you. And I was already talking to people, and this is now, 3 months ago, in which either the person was on the verge of dying or the person had died, and they had no idea what they're going to do next. And that tears you apart. When you don't know what you're going to do, you don't have, I very distinctly remember talking with one of the first folks in which they said, we think maybe we'll be able to have a memorial service in June.
Right.
I bet they're still thinking, I wonder when we're going to have the memorial service.
Right. Yeah.
And when you delay that stuff, even the stuff you want to sometimes put off or ignore, you are delaying some incredibly deep emotions. So it is impacting everyone. And what you said earlier is really true. Obviously I have a feeling many people at least know of somebody with COVID-19, or have read about somebody, certainly have seen some of the things in the news, but it impacts everybody. This is one of those things where a virus, literally and metaphorically, has spread everywhere. And has impacted us.
So not only people who have somebody who is passing away or who has passed away, but a lot of other people are experiencing different kinds of grief as well. We have in our congregation people whose wedding got put off.
Yes.
We have the graduations that didn't happen, people who were looking forward to, young adults going to college for the first, living in the dorm and starting their adult life, that'll be staying home and being online. And so many people with travel plans suspended, just so many ways that we have different kinds of grief. And I'm wondering, are there actually different kinds of grief, or is grief all grief, or is there different kinds of grief?
All grief is the same, and there are different kinds of grief.
Yes and yes.
Yeah, okay. Next question. That's cool. I think, in its broadest sense, grief is loss. And so where it becomes distinctive is, and there's a lot of different ways of answering this and whatever, but what is the relationship? Is the relationship that you are having the grief with, the sense of loss with, is it your job? Is it your grandfather? Is it your child? Is it control? So if you feel like you're losing control, if you feel like you're losing your grandfather, if you feel like you're losing your job, all of those have that sort of broad-based similarity, is that you are either literally, truly losing something or someone, or you are afraid that you are losing someone or something. But then as you deal with the relationship with it, you take someone whose primary, if not exclusive identity is their work, and you take that work away, you are going to be dealing with someone who is in probably some very profound grief. One of the things I try to be careful about, and I always fail at this, I think, is somebody who has had, say, the death of their grandfather, says to someone who has had the death of their spouse, "Oh, I understand what you're going through." And they don't, because the death of a grandfather versus the death of a spouse is going to be very different. Where I fail is actually sometimes, and this is why we have to always be so careful with grief, both as we're dealing with our grief, but as we're trying to respond to somebody else's grief. What if that person who has experienced the death of the grandfather that grandfather was the only significant male they ever had in their life, and was not only a father figure, but a friend figure. And so for them, that was truly a profound loss. And so when they would say to somebody who is experiencing a different kind of a loss, I understand what you're going through, in many ways, I would hope that they never say it that way. But I think I'm giving this example because I always would wish for myself and others that we are as careful as we possibly can be with how we deal with grief, because it really is across the spectrum. You watched your kids go off to school the first time, Jeanette, and I'm quite convinced you were grieving. You know, there's just all kinds of different ways we do it. And grief is certainly one of the most common emotions that all of us experience, one of the most common reactions all of us experience. But because of the relationship we have to the person or the thing, place, will determine how distinctive that is. It's also, you know, going to be situational, and that swings us back to where we are right now, in the sense of, it's one thing to handle grief when who wants to go to a funeral? You know, you and I have been to a whole lot of funerals, and I bet we never overhear people saying, "Oh man, I'm so glad to be here." You know, people don't say that. But we also know, and my guess is anybody who is listening to this, we can think of some of the funerals or graveside services or memorial services that we've been to, and people tell stories, sometimes formally, sometimes informally. You hear things, say, about your parents or about your spouse, in which it really is a small gift. It's an aha moment because somebody tells a story. You know, I was working with your wife, and she was always such a great boss, and then they rattle on about this wonderful story. And, you know, you never knew that because you weren't at work with your wife. And now you have this little gift that comes here, and all of those gifts have been taken away. And so, you know, our grief is different with all the things, and it becomes very problematic when we're not able to normally grieve. And no one right now is able to normally grieve, whether it's a relatively simple loss. You know, maybe somebody's been laid off from work, and they've been reassured continuously from their boss, as soon as we're able to get you back, you're going to be back. And that's from a trustworthy boss. I mean, you know, create a situation where everything is as good as it can be. That person is still grieving that they are no longer working right now. And they're also, along with the mix of other emotions, worrying that regardless of all the reassurances, you know, have things changed? So now I have less control in my life. Another layer of grief comes in. So it just becomes this, you know, there is that broad picture, loss, but the intensity of it is based on the relationship.
When you're talking about everyone's experiencing loss, it brings to mind a situation that happened to me recently that kind of made me really want to have this conversation with you. So I was at the grocery store, and I tried to be very respectful and encouraging, and, you know, have the smiling eyes below my mask, you know, and take an interest in the people, because I realized that the people who are passing all those goods past them and stuff, that they are risking their lives to be able to scan the groceries so we can have food, right? And so I want to be really encouraging and supportive. And I go early in the morning, so there's not a lot of people. And so I was talking to the cashier one day, and I said, you know, well, how's it going for you? And he gave me a response, and I, you know, probed a little bit deeper, and he gave me a response that was kind of, the way he said it at first struck me like, well, that's kind of petty sort of thing. And then I said, wait a minute, you know, listen to what he's saying with your Stephen ministry ears, right? Like, listen how they're really, what he's really saying. And basically what he was saying was, he said, you know, I just want to be able to go to Lowe's. I just want to be able to go to the store. I just want to be able to run. And when I put my Stephen ministry ears on, when I really started listening, what I heard was, I miss how it used to be.
Mhm.
There's always a tension, and I can't just do, what I want to do anymore. And I thought about that, and I thought, here is a layer of grief that perhaps he hasn't acknowledged in his life. I think, like you're saying, everybody's experiencing grief. So are we grieving well? Like, what happens if we don't acknowledge our grief? Are there consequences if we don't acknowledge our grief? And how can we listen to one another and hear the grief in each other? How can we recognize that? How can we be supportive of that when we can't hold conversations like we used to, when we can't take people food and comfort food and things? How can we be supportive? But then also, how are we supportive of ourselves? How do we find that grief that's happening in us and acknowledge it, and what can we do to be supportive? So that's like kind of like three questions. Like, is there consequences if we don't grieve? How can we be supportive of others? How can we acknowledge our own grief and be supportive for ourselves and do self-care?
There are always consequences, I think, with not dealing with our grief, and the and which is not to say you don't have to deal. I mean, you don't have to talk about grief. I mean, it's sometimes it's not so much that you need to talk about your grief in the sense of that, that kind of intimidating sense of what it means to be someone who has experienced a loss, what it means to be a griever. But the more honest you are about things, and the the better it is, I think, in terms of the potential healing and the potential kind of balance you find in your life, and also the potential ability then to have some level of self-care and some ability to reach out to others, which is part of what you're asking about also. But I wanted to kind of tell you one story that at least makes sense to me. But when I was in college, when the dinosaurs roamed the Fresno State campus, I had this project that was suggested that I do. A professor said, "Hey, I hear this, national thing, and some of the stuff you've written recently is really good. And why don't you go ahead and revise it and get it back to me, and I'll submit it for you. And I think there's a good shot that you'll do okay." I procrastinated, and I didn't do it, and I didn't do it. And I started realizing, as I was not doing it and not dealing with it, is that I was starting to avoid this professor who, before that, I had seen as somebody who I enjoyed talking to. I would go down the hallway of where his office was, and he was one of several professors where stop in and say hello for a few seconds. I avoided that hallway. I started, when I walked across campus, I was starting to look in the distance to see if I could see him anywhere. So I would turn around and go in a different direction, so I would not be confronted with the fact that I had not done anything yet. Finally, I just filled with anxiety and filled with kind of self-loathing and all kinds of stuff. I finally went to his office and said, "I am so sorry." And he looked at me and he says, "Oh, that thing? Gosh, what was the deadline was a couple of weeks ago. I really kind of totally forgot about it. It's no problem, Larry. No big deal. It was an opportunity, but we're good." I had spent months worrying and having this anxiety and all of these other, in a sense, negative feelings build up. And when I finally do confront him, it's that realization of this is fine. And I think that's at least one of the ways of looking at what happens if we do bury our grief, if we do ignore it, if we're going through a time like we're going through right now, where we, using, cowboy up, man up, we'll be tough, we can get through it. If you've had a serious loss in your life, and you think you can avoid some of the feelings, that's a dangerous thing, because it just builds up and builds up, and then you are searching the distance to see what you need to avoid so you can go in a completely different direction, and you end up basically avoiding a lot of other things also. And so it's difficult to talk about whether you want to use the word grief, or when you were, sharing about that person in the grocery store with what he was missing. I mean, one of the things I was thinking about is and I've already referenced this earlier, I think, but we so grieve when we don't have control. one of the things that research has revealed out of the state of Oregon, because they were the first ones to do end of life option act type things where with physician assisted suicide, is they've been doing heavy duty research for 20 plus years now. And what they find out is that the folks who are considering some type of physician assisted suicide, the number one reason they're doing it is because of loss of control. They want to have control over their lives. And so this guy at the supermarket can't go to Lowe's, can't go to my favorite restaurant, can't go visit my, mother-in-law, which I'm glad actually I can. But all those things that we might be sort of regretting, they all speak to a loss of control. And if you are not able at some point in some form or another to acknowledge that and to have a few trusted people where you can talk about it, not because there's going to be a solution, but if you don't talk about it, it just will fester. It truly will fester, and it'll begin to impact other things. Now, I have nothing brilliant to say. I mean, I knew you were going to ask me about, how to care for others and self-care. I will tell you that for self-care, there is the Holy Trinity in self-care that we always talk about, and that is sleep and food and exercise. Now, there's always that fourth component, which again, dealing with this pandemic has really taken away, and that is talking, sharing, being with other people, having relationships. Especially, I mean, sometimes when you are grieving, you need to be with somebody who totally understands that you're just suddenly crying, or you're suddenly silent, or you just want to go outside and take a walk, and you don't get kind of weird looks from people when that happens. You need to be around people like that. We can't be around people like that right now. But the self-care component really is about those three things. And any of those three that are, if you notice, okay, I'll really being honest with myself, I'm the only way I'm eating is grazing. Whatever's in the refrigerator, I grab it. If that continues to be, kind of the pattern, you need to stay alert to that, because it's easy to say, and it's very difficult to do. As you think about the importance of rest, as you think about the importance of eating, at least somewhat nutritional food on a normal, regular basis, and as you think about the importance of exercise. And exercise is taking a walk. I mean, it can be as simple as that. I'm not talking about going out and running a mile type thing. I'm talking about just getting some exercise. And part of, helping other folks is also being alert to those same three things. How can you help them do that? And one of the things I talk to folks about sometimes, especially in the grief support groups that I lead, is that people really struggle with sleep. And part of that struggle, sometimes you wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and you're just staring at the ceiling and you're thinking about your beloved, husband that died, and maybe what's going on in your head at that point is, I should have, taken him to the doctor sooner. And you just have these loops that are playing in your head, and there you are staring at your ceiling at 2 a.m. in the morning. Couple things with that. One of which is, I think it's okay to get up, and go in, and what I encourage folks to do is sometimes it's helpful to make some tea. Sometimes it's helpful to drink, just even sit there and read a book for a few minutes and have a glass of water. But don't just keep lying there thinking about things. Do something that's gentle and allows you to break that pattern, and then try to maybe go back when you're a little tired to the sleeping. The other piece of that, though, and this is where it gets really weird for people who are grieving sometimes, is there's some people, I'm not one of them, but there's some people that don't like the nap. I mean, I fully embrace the power of the nap. But there is a certain percentage of folks in which they maybe are sleeping terrible at night, and then they get really drowsy in the afternoon. Of course they do. But if they're of that personality where it's like, well, if I take a nap, I'm a bad person. That's, it's not what one should do. My mother or father told me, blah, blah, blah. Take a nap. Give yourself permission, because anywhere you can grab sleep, anywhere you can grab exercise, the old thing of take the steps rather than take the elevator. But Jeanette, I tell you, everything I could tell you about self-care, everything I could tell you about how to reach out to other folks to provide some extra care for them, it is just thrown off kilter because of this pandemic. I'm not bringing you a casserole.
Right.
I am not able to. I can take a walk with you, but I can't put my arms around your shoulder, and that hurts. It hurts both of us, But even within the limits, we do have things that we can do. And again, you can kind of say right now what I'm going to say. There's my dog. We can text. We can FaceTime. We can do what we're doing right now. We can write a note. I had a friend ask me week before last. Her sister is in a care facility back in New York, and with a lot of worries in that particular care facility about COVID-19. And she put a little post out on Facebook saying, my sister would love to get some letters from somebody, anybody. I can write a letter. I love the person who asked it. I know her from the past. I've never met her sister. I probably never will meet her sister. I wrote her a letter. Wasn't a great letter, but I'm hoping that I was one of several people that sent a letter to her, and she had something physically in her hand that she could read and maybe get a chuckle over, and maybe then have a conversation later with her sister about it a little bit. So all of those little things are potential things we can do. Many of them will feel frustrating. Because I have a great story that I got from a grief workshop where his name is Alan Wofelt, and who I really recommend. He has a place in Colorado, but he said that long ago, at least in some cultures, and that there was a sense that when you take food over to somebody, you don't just take it over in any dish you can find, you take it over in your most special dish. And in fact, some dishes, some placewares or whatever were designated as, these are the grieving plates or the grieving bowls, but they were really nice. And so you would take the food over to somebody and you left them that, but then you would come back the second time to pick up the bowl. And so there was a guaranteed 2 visits with that tradition. But even in telling that story, that's the difficulty, so yep. And I guess the one final piece I would say about that is what I hear sometimes from folks when in grief support groups, I encourage them, if you have a good friend that lives across the country or across the town, if they're a person where you need to call them at 2 a.m. in the morning, they are going to welcome that call because they love you. But their response is, no, I don't want to bother them. And my advice is, bother the people you love. You at a time like this, we all understand. We are all in this together. It is a very common thing that's going on right now. As horrific as it is, every single person understands that we are more isolated and more alone and more out of control than we typically have been for all of our lives. Don't hesitate to bother somebody. Don't hesitate to be bothered. In the sense of the various ways, limited ways we can communicate.
Our time is coming to a close, but what I'm hearing is everyone is in grief. Not everyone's acknowledging it, maybe not even us. And we don't have good protocols in place for how to help people in grief like standard things we used to do. And so part of it is then we just extend grace to one another to the best of our abilities, because we're all learning together in these new times. But I'm wondering what we can do to help be more mindful, to process our own grief. I know that I always encourage my congregation, I tell them every day, at least 15 minutes with God, at least 15 minutes every day, and not just giving God a list of honeydew, but to actually spend time listening to God and doing the introspection, the reflection, to get in touch with those pains and the frustrations. But I think what I'm hearing from you is also the acknowledgement that every one of us is grieving in different ways, but all of us are in a state of grief. All of us have lost control. All of us have had to let go of our routines. All of us have had to let go of something that we normally would do to help keep us healthy, like hugging our friends and being able just to chat to people face to face. I've heard people saying, "Oh, it's going to be so good to see people again." Face to face, and I'm like, yeah, okay, we're gonna have our masks on, right? And they're like, yeah, but we can still see their eyes. We can still see the smile of their eyes. It'll be so good. And so to be introspective about that, and how do we take that then into the world, like everywhere we go, because every single person we're encountering is experiencing some level of grief. How do we acknowledge that? What can we do to help be encouraging to each other? Like because the work you do, Larry, you often meet people who are not fully acknowledging their grief, right? That's part of the work you do.
Sure.
How can we then be for one another that source of encouragement and understanding that allows people to acknowledge their grief so that they can do a little bit of processing and thereby relieving the festering, right? What is there something that you would say every day, try to do this to one or two people or something? Is there something that you could encourage us to do or how to be?
In a general way, what I'm going to share with you is very simplistic.
Yes.
But I think it really is important. If you and I had this conversation a year ago, I would say the exact same thing I'm going to tell you right now.
Okay.
Everybody's wounded. Everybody is wounded. With this pandemic, we actually now are sharing a kind of woundedness that adds to the individual woundedness that I think everybody does carry around with them. And so on my best days, and I have some far from best days, but on those best days, I do remember that sense that every person is wounded. And so right now, what I would always encourage folks to do is if you can take the extra moment. I hurry through the supermarket, pretty darn quickly. I'm the guy that, excuse me, I do the grocery shopping in our family. And I used to look forward to it. I don't anymore. But I will still take that time when I get up to that clerk and ask how he or she is doing. And so I think it's just important to take those extra moments, both for you being with that other person, but also allowing them to actually be with you. And one of the things I was thinking about after I read through your questions and knowing some of what we were going to be talking about is I just thought again about one of the most familiar parables of, I think, the poorly named Good Samaritan, but that's what we know it as. And one of the things I have thought about for the longest of times, partly influenced by folks who influenced me, but as part of what that Samaritan ended up doing is, on his own journey that he was taking, wherever he was going, we really don't know exactly where he was going, but he was on his own journey and he saw somebody who was hurt. And he did some relatively simple things to make sure that person could continue on their journey. And at most, he promised, the person he took the injured person to, that he would pay the bills when he came through again later on. That was the limit of what he was going to do for the person who was beat up and left for dead. That was practical. It was possible. It was within his power of doing it. He did not do anything extraordinary, in a sense. He just made sure to try to keep the other person able to go on his journey. And if I was preaching on that right now, part of the weirdness of that parable is I really feel so often like those two people that passed the beaten person up, that were on that way to someone else who saw him as unclean, or however you want to interpret it. But this shelter in place has forced us to be the two people that pass by. But I believe there are still ways, as we take our own journey, to, even if it's in the simplest possible ways, but to help other people continue on their journey. And a lot of that, I think, does come down to really, in those moments, in those seconds, being with people. Remember, you're not going to sit there and say, so I know you're wounded, so I want to be really supportive of you today. Just, in your heart and your soul, be reminded, every single person is hurting. And boy, right now, are we really hurting. And so whatever you can do, a gesture. I love, Jeanette, what you've talked about in terms of your smiling eyes. I want to see the whole face. But maybe all you can give right now, but that's a lot, is those smiling eyes. And if you give that to somebody in a moment or two, I think that helps them along on their journey.
Thank you so much for spending some time with us today, Larry. We really appreciate that.
Sure.
You were able to share with us and bring to us some words of wisdom to guide us. Each one of us then wounded, each one of us hurting. And truly, I think this unusual time has revealed the deep woundedness of our nation.
Yes.
The festering is exploding.
Yes.
And so being present to ourselves to find out those areas of grief in ourselves so that we can process it, but then being present for others and really listening and maybe hearing in a new and deeper way of the pain that others have been carrying, so that as a nation we could heal, that we could receive some wisdom and guidance to put our feet on a different path, a better path. Maybe this is kind of lancing the wound for us. Maybe we'll find greater health. Well, thanks for taking the time to be with us today, Larry.
You're welcome.